The first presenter we have here is brought to you by the STA Women in Finance committee that we have. That committee is chaired by Julie Andrus of KeyBank Capital Markets. Julie also serves on the STA board as a governor. I'm going to turn the call over to Julie, and then she's going to introduce our speaker. And right now there are no other announcements other than just really, again, can't thank you enough for dialing in and listening in today. The response has been awesome, and please stay with us for the next day and a half. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Julie.
Good afternoon. As Jim said, I am Julie Andrus. I'm the co-chair of the STA Women in Finance, or STA WIF committee, and I'm honored to introduce today's keynote address from Deborah Walton, Chief Revenue Officer at Refinitiv. This presentation is brought to you by the STA Women in Finance Committee and my co-chair and fellow STA Governor, Kate McAllister from Global Liquidity Partners. We're both delighted to have everybody here joining us. For those of you who are not familiar with the STA Women in Finance, we are a national committee that operates under the umbrella of the Security Traders Association. The committee is comprised of individuals who serve at the STA national level, as well as represent STA affiliates that have an active Women in Finance effort. I'd like to personally thank each and every volunteer that is for all their work and dedication this year. Without them, none of this would be possible. I'd also like to thank our past Women in Finance keynote speakers, Jill Summers, Suni Harford, Susan Estes, Tracy Castle-Newman, and of course, last year's speaker, mountain climber Steph Davis. Finally, I'd like to thank Christine Sandler. Christine was instrumental in launching the STA Women in Finance effort 7 years ago. Since the STA Women in Finance's inception, we have witnessed growth of women participating on panel discussions and affiliate boards. In fact, when the STA holds its first Board of Governor meetings in 2021, 6 of the 15 governors will be women. This growth has been achieved through a disciplined approach to identify talented women candidates to be considered for such positions. Earlier today in their opening remarks, Jim and Chris mentioned the optimism STA felt coming into 2020 and how, like so many firms, we had a good plan that would build upon our achievements from 2019. The STA Women in Finance was part of that plan, and like the broader STA Association, we've had to adjust and pivot as well. While we maintained and achieved many of our objectives, including today's keynote speaker, our biggest accomplishment will come later this year at the first STA Awards event, where several categories will recognize women and men for outstanding achievements in philanthropy and fostering diversity and inclusion within their industry. The theme of this year's conference is anew today. It's meant to capture our industry's response to the pandemic, which has defined our behavior both personally and professionally. The STA recognizes that diversity and inclusion should be more than a simple promise. It must be a constant business priority. Increasing diversity and inclusion at all levels is not just good corporate citizenship, it's smart business. Extensive research shows that companies that prioritize diversity and inclusion are more successful, profitable, and innovative. And now a few words on our keynote presenter. Deborah Walton leads all sales, client and partner relationship management, and marketing development activities for Refinitiv. Her global team operating in 65 countries brings the entire range of Refinitiv solutions to market the data analytics and workflow needs of their customers. Deborah has lived and worked on 3 continents and has held senior executive positions across product, content, sales, and marketing at Refinitiv and the Financial and Risk Department Business Division of Thomson Reuters since she joined the firm in 2003. She is also a board member of TradeWeb's Board of Managers. Deborah is a tireless advocate for gender equality and speaks globally on diversity and leadership, as well as the importance of ESG more broadly. She's an advisory board member at Springboard, a New York-based nonprofit that brings together entrepreneurs, investors, and industry experts to help women take their business plans to market. We're very excited to have her today. So Deborah, I will let you take away from there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Julie. Let me just share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see my screen. I think this is one of the most stressful moments of being invited to speak at a great event. Is always a bit of a stressful moment, but these days in a virtual world, the most stressful part, I think, comes with the interface to the technology and making sure that everybody can see my slides. So hopefully you can, and we've gotten the most challenging part out of the way. It's truly an honor to be here as part of the Security Traders Association annual event. And I'm particularly more honored having listened to Julie describe the keynote speakers that you've had come before me. It's a great honor to join those ranks. I'm really delighted to speak to you today on the topic of diversity and inclusion. It is something that is very near and dear to my heart and has been for many years. I hope today to share with you some of my observations and some of my learnings. And since all of our learnings and observations are really, in fact, I think shaped by our own life experiences, I thought I would actually just start just with a little bit of my life story. I actually grew up in rural Australia. As you can see from the slide, it was a long time ago. We don't need to go into exactly how long ago that was. When I was growing up in a small country town in Australia, less than 5% of Australians pursued a college degree or had any tertiary education. And that was in fact true for me. My father was a farmer. My mother worked in the local post office. And our conversations around the dinner table at night was, you know, what's a good job for a girl? You know, my parents' aspirations for me was to marry one of the local farmers and have a much larger farm. So perhaps not surprisingly, my choices of jobs coming out of high school was to be a hairdresser, work in a local retail store, or join a bank. I chose to join a bank. Through a twist of fate, which is a huge story in itself, and I'll spare you that for now, I found myself moving to Sydney in the late 70s, and not with a career in mind. I happened into a role working for a brokerage firm in Sydney. It was a bond brokerage firm, coincidentally, and that company had built a bond analytic platform to do analytics of Australian government securities market, and decided that they wanted to actually productize that platform out to the buy side and also to their competitors in the market in Australia and New Zealand. And I joined them to actually lead their sales and marketing efforts. Just to give you a sense of the technology of the day, we had someone sitting on our trading desk actually creating a yield curve every day and actually downloading that onto a floppy disk and FedExing it out to our customers around Australia and New Zealand. And that of the day was the version of a real-time data network that obviously we've all come to expect now. In 1985, I was approached by my boss to say, we have an opportunity to pitch this business to Telerate. Some of you on the call will remember Telerate. I was 25 at the time and had this incredible opportunity to jump on a plane and go do a major pitch to Telerate's leadership in New York. Our connection in New York was a gentleman by the name of David Darst, who some of you will also remember had written the complete bond book, the Bible of the fixed income market at that point in time. As you could probably imagine, I was pretty terrified. I was a young girl from the Aussie bush, and here I was getting on a plane to go do a pitch to David Darst and ultimately to Telerate. That was the first time I think I ever was aware of this concept of the imposter syndrome. I'll talk about that a little bit more in my remarks, but that's really the sense, you know, of you're out of your depth, you're over your skis, and that's certainly how I felt. But the excitement and the thought of visiting New York and having this opportunity really powered me through. We were successful in negotiating a joint venture for global distribution with Telerate. And on the back of that, we took our company public in Australia and raised 20 million in development funds by listing it on the Australian Stock Exchange. And I became the youngest female director of an ASX listed company at that point in time. I moved to New York to run the business, spent a lot of time with Telerate, and I ultimately moved to Cantor Fitzgerald, which was an amazing part of my career, an incredible place to work. And I was one of the first female partners at Cantor Fitzgerald. The interesting thing for me there was I never ever felt like I was held back in my career because I was a woman. But the thing that really struck me at social events, of which there were many, I was never really sure whether to sit with my male colleagues or go talk to the wives. So I was very conscious of the fact that I was very much in a minority. I moved on from Cantor Fitzgerald, and I joined Thomson Financial in 2003, and have had numerous great opportunities there, as Julie mentioned. In 2016, I was approached to take on the Chief Product Officer role and move to Switzerland. At that point in time, I was pretty comfortable with my house in Connecticut, my apartment in Manhattan, and thought, why would I want to do this? I reluctantly moved to Zurich. I have to say, it now truly is probably the best 3 years that I've ever spent, which is a really important reminder for all of us to be open to new opportunities and new experiences. Sadly, that came to an end in 2018. We announced that we were spinning out the financial business of Thomson Reuters, and we were going to be acquired by Blackstone. And I moved back to New York to be the Chief Revenue Officer of the new company. And last year, as I'm sure many of you know, in August, we announced that we would be sold or acquired, in fact, by the London Stock Exchange. So in that period of those 10 months, we've actually taken the value of Refinitiv from 20 billion to 27 billion. And now we're heading headlong into the integration work that's ahead of us. So it has been, for me, I think, a really exciting journey. And I just want to kind of summarize a couple of lessons from along the way. To me, these are my 4 C's. Anyone that's worked for me over the last probably 5 years knows about the 4 C's. To me, the first is commitment. If whatever you are, whether it's a great sportsman, a great athlete, golfer, or someone successful in career, we've all made tremendous commitment and we've made a lot of sacrifices. I often get asked, can you have it all? And the answer is yes, but not all at once. Many of us in the early stages of our career have to make decisions between family and our career. It's hard to raise a family and spend 200 days on the road like I typically was doing before COVID. But as I've gotten towards the end of my career, my sacrifice comes from having a retired husband and many retired friends who will call me up and say, do you want to go and play golf for 2 days next week? Or do you want to go on a 4-week cruise of the Amazon? I'm like, yes, I would love to, but I have a day job. So that commitment really continues to be, I think, an incredibly important aspect for all of us. Probably the most important thing for me is really curiosity and really continuing to be in a state of continual learning. When I became the Chief Revenue Officer at Refinitiv, I wanted to create the hallmark of our organization as a learning culture. And I've really worked hard to do that. I say to my team all the time, if you're working in financial markets today, unless you're committed to continual learning, you won't keep up. You will fall behind. One of the greatest stories I heard in this regard was Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. When asked how he measures his success, one might think he might say market cap of Microsoft, personal wealth, but no, in fact, he measures his success by how much he has learned in the last year, which I think is a great benchmark for all of us. I think courage is really important. We all have to step up and do things that stretch us if we want to develop our career. We mentioned the concept of the imposter syndrome and this sense that you're feeling out of your depth, you're not really qualified to do this job, people will find out you're not qualified to do this job, and that can be a paralyzing factor, for many of us. And I've been surprised over the years when I've asked people, who experiences that. Pretty much honestly, every hand in the room goes up. My belief is that unless you are feeling that fairly routinely throughout your career, you're really not stretching yourself and pushing your boundaries. And then last but not least, I think, it's about confidence, and showing up, as a confident leader is critical, whether it's the boardroom, whether it's in a sales pitch with a client, or whether it's with your team. So look, I feel very fortunate, blessed that I've had a really great career. I've had a lot of tremendous sponsors along the way, but I'm also extremely mindful that there are many that are probably way more capable than me that haven't had those opportunities and that same sponsorship. And oftentimes that can become or can come as a result of the inherent bias that still lives in our workplace today. So now I really want to turn and talk to the issue of diversity and inclusion, and what I see going on in the market and how we can really continue to drive the much needed change. Fortunately, the business case for diversity is now becoming really well understood. People know that it's not just the right thing to do, but in fact, it is a good thing to do for business. The Credit Suisse gender study shows that companies with at least one female board director have outperformed companies that don't. The real key number, of course, is 3. And most companies now do aspire to have 3 women on their boards. At Refinitiv, we've tried to use our capabilities in data and index creation. And we created many years ago a diversity and inclusion index that takes from 7,000 companies in our database, or 80% of the world's market cap, to choose the 100 most high-performing companies in terms of diversity and inclusion and track them on a financial performance basis. And what we've seen is that this index has outperformed MSCI World and ACWI by a considerable amount over the last 5 years. Now, what it does show is that there is a high correlation between diversity and performance. We can probably debate whether it's cause or effect, but the correlation is very high. So look, if we put the data aside, the societal evidence is also really clear. There's, I'm sure, a number of millennials in the audience, and I'm sure there are many parents of millennials in the audience, and we all know that millennials today will, in fact, vote with their feet. They will choose who they work for, who they buy from, and what companies they invest in based on the social conscience of those companies. So let's just talk for a moment about the rise in sustainable investment. It's really quite impressive. Our Lipper Funds data shows that the amount invested into ESG funds grew 3 times from 2018 to 2019. And if the 2020 trend continues, there will be $250 billion US in ESG-based funds by year end. 120 billion of sustainable bonds were issued in the second quarter of 2020, twice the amount of the previous quarter. Green bonds, perhaps not surprisingly, continue to dominate issuance. I think it's interesting that EMEA, or Europe, as a geography, dominates the issuance as well. I mentioned before our Refinitiv Diversity and Inclusion Index, and I wanted to share with you the top 25 companies in our index based on our last rebalance of the index. And you'll see that there are 5 financial services companies in the top 25, and a big congratulations to BlackRock for topping the list in our index in the last quarter. So let's just take a quick look at how we are doing. This is some data on women in top positions reporting into the C-suite. The top performing companies are in the Nordics and in Australia. Some of you will know that these countries actually have regulation, and many of them have comply or explain on listings, and that has certainly driven a tremendous positive trend towards increased diversity in companies in those countries. And of course, it's interesting to note the cultural challenges that act as a counterweight to the advancement of women. Japan showing just over 1% as their benchmark. The US with 15%, compared to the high-performing companies in the 20s, really does act as a reminder to us that here in the US, we have a ways to go. Just a few more stats. Gender diversity on corporate boards, really positive to see a slow and steady trend positively of women on corporate boards. By the way, financial services, 14% to 20% in the last 3 years, good positive progress, but still more work to be done. So if we look at female managers in the business, the trend, which is beneath the board level, is really not as positive. The progress is really pretty glacial, especially in the Americas. So if we all believe that it's not just the right thing to do to have more women in leadership, more diversity in leadership, how do we really move the needle? I know that personally, I began this conversation about diversity and inclusion in 1990. 30 years later, we're still not there. The progress is great, but we have to keep at this and we have to turn words into action. So I want to share with you now just a few things that we've done at Refinitiv. And our Refinitiv push towards more diversity and inclusion began when we were part of Thomson Reuters, and it really starts at the top. So in 2012, when Jim Smith became the CEO of Thomson Reuters, some of you may remember if you followed our company closely, it was a pretty tough time for us in the business. And one would think Jim had a lot of issues that he needed to deal with, apart from diversity and inclusion. But Jim, in fact, in his second month as CEO, decided he was going to form a Women in Leadership task force. Now, I had an experience back in the 90s when I was on the board of the YWCA, where a corporate CEO was really engaging us on the board of the Y to really do a lot around diversity and inclusion. He was sponsoring events, and we thought, wow, this is great. And probably about 6 months after we engaged him, we all opened the Wall Street Journal business section one day and saw that he was the victim of a class action suit. So with that in mind, when Jim approached me and asked me to join our Women in Leadership steerco, I was like, this is a little concerning. And I said, Jim, why are you focusing on that now, given all of the other issues that arguably you have to tackle? And his response was very clear. He said, this can't be a flavor of the month, a flavor of the year program. We have to move the needle on diversity, and it's going to take my entire tenure as CEO to do that. So we then made a public commitment to a 40% goal, and that speaks to the issue of what you measure, you can manage. And we put that out there very publicly. It made it very real, and it made a real perception of how seriously we were taking this inside the company. By the way, we've now just made an equally powerful statement around race. I think the third really important learning here is the importance of allies. The issue of diversity and inclusion is not just a women's issue or not just a people of color issue. It is an issue for leadership. At Refinitiv, Brian West, our CFO, is the executive sponsor of our Women's Network. We also put a huge emphasis on how we could build the pipeline. How often do you hear people say, I can't find any women for the job? I would have liked to have promoted a woman, but there was no one in the organization. So we have to break down that, very simple way to outstep the accountability and really focus on building the pipeline. Let me just take that down a little bit further. The task force, as I said, had CEO sponsorship, and we were aiming at 40% of senior leadership to be female by 2020. And that was in 2012 that we actually started that. So it was a realistic, conservative stretch, but realistic, a target that we really could feel like we could achieve. We opted and co-opted our executive leadership team and our ELT +1 as champions. We also leveraged our Refinitiv networks to help us, but we put a really specific target on hiring, promotion, and retention. Our grad programs, every year when we brought graduates in, we looked at the intake through a lens. Do we have enough diversity? And you know what? The answer was no, we didn't. Without a conscious look at that, we didn't have enough diversity. So it became, we have to bring through the graduate program more diversity in. Our summer interns, we made sure that there was a good diverse mix in our internship program. And then for all new roles, we insisted on having diverse slates and also having diverse interview panels. We launched formal coaching, mentoring, and sponsorship programs. And we also activated what we were doing in external programs so that we could play our part in really continuing to amplify the importance of keeping the eye on diversity and inclusion. So where are we today? We have achieved that 40% goal that we set for ourselves. 4 members of our executive committee today are female. That's 50% of our executive committee. And many of our most senior and influential roles are now performed by women. And roles that are in the typically not female strength roles. Alex Caesar is our Chief Technology Officer. Our Chief Privacy Officer is a female. Our Global Head of Talent, our Global Head of Customer Success Management, and more recently, our Head of Canada. So forgive me for a bit of a shameless plug here, but I'm actually incredibly proud of what we have achieved. And it's not by accident. It's been a lot of hard work and a very real focus on diversity and inclusion. So let me turn in closing really to address, obviously, today, you know, and as the focus of the conference is all about, we are in a very much a new today. I guess there was a deliberate move away from the new normal, which many of us shudder at actually talking about. But I do think we now are at a time when the current world is really facing an environment where diversity is more important and can have more impact than ever before. There's no doubt that in the financial markets, we've faced many market crises before. I, in the beginning of my career, lived through the October 1987 crash. Many of us, of course, lived through the global financial crisis in 2008. But this is really unprecedented. Every company in every industry into simultaneous lockdown. I know we've all been surprised by really how much more productive we've been, and there are huge benefits to health and wellness. I think for the first time in for me, the first time in probably 30 years, I'm not in a continued state of jet lag. And, you know, but I do think it is taking its toll. There is a high degree of burnout starting to happen. You know, I think some of us have said, you know, we're not really sure whether we're working from home or whether we're sleeping in the office. It's becoming very difficult to switch off. The workday just seems to continue. And then, you know, if you put aside the environment, there is just this human desire to convene. And I don't know about you. You know, I took a bunch of my team out. We did a 2-day Ryder Cup golf tournament over the last 2 weeks. And when everybody saw each other for the first Friday, people were in tears. They were so happy to see each other. And it was just such an amazing experience to be together and see people in 3 dimension. You know, people really do want to convene. It's critical for corporate culture and new starters. I mean, we've pivoted our entire onboarding program to doing it virtual, and that actually has been amazing. We won't go back to doing our onboarding physically. Too expensive, not efficient. So the onboarding is virtual and it's great. But you know, people need role models. They need mentors. And I think many companies that are trying to get people back into the office now are doing that because of that cultural issue and that need for mentors. New client business is also really hard. You know, I can tell you as Chief Revenue Officer, this has been a tough year in terms of sales. And really getting back to being able to take clients out to dinner, play golf with them, that's been one thing we've been able to do. But really getting back to starting those new relationships and nurturing relationships is really key. So look, for me, I really think that the future of work is hybrid. You know, we're chatting beforehand, you know, in the green room, you know, the hope and aspirations of Jim Toes is that this conference next year is a hybrid, you know, with some people will convene, some will be virtual. We're planning our sales kickoff for 3,000 salespeople in January. And we're hoping that in some of our 30 offices around the world that are open, they'll be physical, the rest will convene virtually. And we will never go back to an environment where we are 5 days in the office. In order to get to that new world, we're going to have leaders who think differently. We're going to have leaders who can empathize and who can be attuned and really sensitive to risk, and also who can lead with tremendous compassion. When I moved to New York in the late 80s, I was stunned when I got here that all of the women that I worked with wore navy blue suits and wore little bow ties. And what I realized that the corporate culture of Wall Street was really aimed at trying to get women to act more like men. I honestly can't tell you how many coaches that I burned through, with 360 feedback saying, we need to get her to be less emotional. Fortunately, for me, at least, I think we've evolved now, and most progressive companies really acknowledge and celebrate the values of diverse thought and expression. I also think if you look at the interesting pictures in the bottom right, it's been really fascinating for me to see how many of the countries who are leading in this global pandemic are led by women. In the 80s, we never aspired to have caring and empathetic leadership. But today, I do believe that most of our employees want and in fact expect an emotional connection with their leadership. Now more than ever, I think we really need diverse leadership. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you for joining us today. God bless and best wishes.